Hi, I'm Don Cantor, former co-director of JLIC at Johns Hopkins University and current director at the Richmond Jewish Learning Experience in Richmond, Virginia.
And I'm Alex Ozar, co-director of JLIC at Yale University. And this is the Torah JLIC podcast. JLIC supports thousands of young Jews in their college years and beyond, providing them with the nourishment they need to sustain an upward trajectory of Jewish commitment and growth as they enter the broader world. And the animating engine of that effort, that has always been and will always be Talmud, high-level, richly meaningful, thoughtfully creative Torah learning, ambitiously attuned to the realities of where our students are. On the Torah JLIC podcast, we hope to share some of that Torah with you. Thanks for listening.
On this episode, we hear from Rabbi Elie Beuchler. He and his wife Tamar are the directors of JLIC at Columbia University and Barnard College. Elie is originally from Dix Hills, New York. He attended Yeshivat Oraita and has a BA in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis. He also has a master's from YU's Barnard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies in Medieval Jewish History, and he also received his smicha, his rabbinic ordination, from YU's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. Tamar, who is also a neuropsychologist, is unable to join us because she's working at the hospital while we're recording. Rav Elie served as the assistant rabbi of the Jewish Center on the Upper West Side from 2019 to 2022. He also has hobbies which include true crime and Jewish genealogy. Now, Elie, my first question is, did they make you wear a top hat at the Jewish Center?
I did indeed wear a top hat every time I was in the main sanctuary, but we don't wear it in the summer, right? Because it's too hot in the summer, not appropriate.
Is that like a Memorial Day thing, or is it just when it gets to be too hot?
So I feel like every year there was a debate whether it was Memorial Day or Shavuos that was the cutoff date. And to be honest, I don't remember which one it is, but someone listening might have a very strong opinion on that matter.
And was it more than a top hat?
Oh yeah, it was a whole morning suit. You had like the jacket and the pants that were striped, kind of looked like a doorman. So if you ever wore it on the way to shul, sometimes people would ask you to open doors for you in the city because they assumed you were working at the building you passed.
That's awesome. And how did it feel? Did it feel special davening in a morning suit?
I will let my silence answer the question.
What's the difference between a top hat and a regular black hat, which you might see people wearing during davening?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One looks like you're on the Titanic, and one it looks like you're in Lakewood. So that's probably the best way to look at it.
Fantastic. What kind of Jewish genealogy are you into?
The personal one, I guess. So I've been into genealogy since middle school. Started from a project I did, and then I went on to do some program one summer in high school downtown at the Center for Jewish History. And after that, I've always loved doing it. So I've gone to archives using all the online resources, and I've gone back quite far on a number of my family, going back 8 to 10 generations in a number of places. Last summer was really fun. We took a family history trip with a number of my cousins and my dad, and we went to Slovakia, where my great-grandparents on one of my sides is from.
That's really cool. How did you get to JLIC?
So, somewhat in a roundabout fashion. So, I went to Brandeis, as you mentioned, and my wife and I actually met at Brandeis University. With the Pardos, were a JLIC couple for the last 3 years that I was there, and really had a positive experience with them, and had always thought that could be something I involved myself in down the road. And while I was in Smicha, definitely thought about JLIC. But my wife, who's a neuropsychologist, was just starting her schooling for neuropsychology, and she realized that would be way too much for her to juggle. So instead, I went the pulpit route, went to the Jewish Center, and then about 2 years ago, I was looking to look at other opportunities, and I was reconnected to JLIC, and really just had an amazing time. Went to Columbia to check it out, and we've been here now over 2 years.
That's awesome. And you're also working on a PhD?
Yes. I'm actually currently studying for a big exam for that. Yes, and working medieval Jewish history at Yeshiva University. and hopefully by the end of the summer I'll have a better sense as to what I'm actually going to write my dissertation on. So stay tuned.
Has there been any joining of your personal genealogy with your medieval Jewish history studies?
If only I could reach that far back. So not quite. My academic studies typically end somewhere in the 1400s, and I don't quite reach that far back. Although everyone says they're somehow related to Rashi, which is probably true, just from a numerical sense. But yeah.
Wait, why numerically is it likely for everyone to be related to Rashi?
So I'm not a math major. However, Ashkenazi Jews, we've married way too many people who are third and fourth and second and first cousins. And as you go further and further back, every Ashkenazi Jew essentially is related with only a few levels of distance, right? If they say the whole world is only a certain number of distance away from each other, so Ashkenazi Jews are even closer. There's really interesting research of the last couple of years about two different kind of groups of Ashkenazi Jews in Germany during the 1300s, and there was one that had a little bit more Spanish influence, one that was a little bit more Italian. But essentially, at the end of the day, you can probably trace every Jew back to some of the major figures in Ashkenaz.
That's cool. Haven't they used mitochondrial DNA for gay root issues with Ashkenazi Jews?
So I know that it has come up. Some have tried to. On the one hand, it can sometimes be, it can sound on a theoretical level very beneficial, but on a practical level, it can also be very challenging because you end up in situations where you could theoretically postle people at the same rate.
Interesting. Okay. All right. I feel like to a certain extent we've buried the lead because Rev Elie, you and Columbia, Barnard, JLIC made some headlines in the last few months. But let's go back and just talk about this year, which has been very different. And if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like, and maybe what ideas and what Torah have guided you and your students through it all.
Sure. I'll kind of start a little bit with the Torah, but we can definitely circle back to the Torah and how the Torah connects. But the Shabbos Shuvah shir, I guess, that I gave just 2 weeks or so before October 7th was all about the idea and the notion of hachana, of preparation. And essentially, how on the one hand, we often think in our own lives, preparation is means to an end, right? You prepare something in order to get to the outcome. And so I spent quite a bit of time during that year, and I can delve a little bit more into it as we discuss, how really the Jewish approach is that hachana in and of itself is it has a religious significance, and it's not just about getting to some sort of goal at the end, right? It's part of a process in which we find really significant, meaningful religious significance. And when just about 2 weeks later, everyone's world was shattered, and then particularly on many college campuses, when the hatred and vitriol really started emerging, we realized how, not only was the state of Israel unprepared, but really world Jewry, and specifically college students and everyone around us, were unprepared for the tsunami of hate that we would be faced. And it certainly was a learning curve in terms of how we were going to face it. But over the last number of months, the Jewish community at Columbia and Barnard is incredibly strong and resilient, and we are facing antisemitism at a really unprecedented level here on our campus.
And so, how did preparation or the lack thereof guide you through everything that you went through on campus?
Yeah, so when we prepare for something, when anyone prepares for something, you prepare a meal at home, so you know the ingredients, you know how to make it, and you put it up. When it came to October 7th and the aftermath, there really was no playbook for Jewish students on campus, for JLIC, for anyone, when it came to how to handle this. And so we were all learning on the job. And in many ways, I think leading up to that moment, we had all felt perhaps a false sense of security, right? Physical security in the state of Israel, and also kind of psychological, emotional security or sense of belonging on many university campuses as well. And so I think it's more or less, and like you said, Don, in a lack of hachana. However, on the positive, once we started to face the realities, we did have immense tools, right? The power of the Jewish community the resources that we had, both in terms of intellect, community, the way in which we were able to connect with organizations outside of the university to help us. And that would take various forms: the political wing, the legal wing, all those pieces actually displayed that despite the fact that we felt very unprepared, we had a very deep sense of preparation that was actually already set for us before.
So in your Shabbos Shuvah Drasha, how did you connect preparation to the season?
Yeah, so part of what I wanted to look at, and it's something that I actually feel not around Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but it's actually something I always felt at Hanukkah time, and I'll use Hanukkah as an example for the following reason. I always felt that Hanukkah has a really rich kind of Hasidic Ner, Torah. There's just like a lot of ways in which you can look at what the Chanukiah represents and what the Ner Mitzvah represents. And I remember specifically during my gap here in Israel, spending so much time learning about Hanukkah and its meaning, especially from a Hasidic perspective. And then we came to the mitzvah itself. And I lit the candle, and I was like, that's it? Like, I just spent all this time preparing, and it's so meaningful. And then I was just lighting a candle. And there was this almost this letdown that, yes, I'm performing this mitzvah, but everything beforehand almost felt so much more meaningful. And I had this like moment of like, what's going on here? There's some sort of a dissonance between the action and my preparation. But in thinking about the Yamim Noraim and what I taught, there is a rich tradition of this notion of hachana. For example, Shabbos is the prime example, right? This notion of preparing for Shabbos in and of itself is a fulfillment of a mitzvah to prepare for Shabbos. And there's much discussion already going back to Hillel and Shammai, right, about what it means to prepare for Shabbos. And this notion of hachana is in and of itself religiously meaningful. And I want to share with you one thought that came up, one piece of Torah that I thought that was actually very meaningful in terms of hachana. And it comes out in the Sfas Emes on Ha'azinu. The Sfas Emes on Ha'azinu. He's describing this notion of preparation actually around Sukkot time, and this idea, generally speaking, that the beginning of the counting towards sins, right up until that point, how could it be that the Jewish people sin, but finally Sukkot comes around and we're now able to sin again because we're past Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and he's essentially asking, like, what do you mean it's time? It's Moed, right? Of course, it's not a time for sin. People are envisioning a beautiful time with Hashem in the Sukkah with lulav and etrog. How is it the beginning of a time where we're counting cheshbon avonos? So he points out that when we think about ushmarsem va'asisem, this notion of keeping and doing the mitzvos, he suggests, and he says it in a quite powerful way that you and I think, would not be able to say. He says, and I quote, "Va'od ki mi yuchal lekayem hamitzvah kimishpata." Right? Who could seriously think that when they perform a mitzvah, that they're performing it exactly the way Hashem needs them to? And therefore he uses that as a method to point out that really it's all the preparation that has almost more religious significance in an intellectual and a psychological perspective than even the kiyum itself, at the moment that we actually do the Ma'aseh HaMitzvah. And in some ways that also speaks to this thought that I often hear from students, and I think we all think about it. Sometimes mitzvahs can seem like a checklist, right? It's like, I did the mitzvah, check. But I think what the Sfas Emes is pointing out in this notion of hachana is that if you do the mitzvah with the checkbox, right, you really miss the whole point of everything leading up to it. If you haven't properly prepared for it, if you run into Shabbos and you haven't had that time to prepare for it, then you're actually missing a huge part of the culture of what it means to be Jewish, of the culture of what it means to engage meaningfully with mitzvah.
Would you say that it almost seems like the mitzvah is ideally just a natural result of the person you are, having gone through the preparation process?
Yeah, I actually really like that way of looking at it, right? It's like, if you've put in the energy and the effort, so in some ways the actual mitzvah is the culmination of that, and we should try to shift the way in which we relate to mitzvos to a process formulation, as opposed to, this is exactly how you do it. And I think, listen, our world has very much prepared us for the checkbox way of doing things. Just think about, the Shulchan Aruch for a moment, right? classic text of halacha, and it tells you exactly how to do the mitzvah. Right? It's a list of how to do the mitzvah. And if you just read the Shulchan Aruch without, let's say, the Beis Yosef, his kind of larger work describing all the ways in which he got to the answer, it does give you a checkbox formulation in a sense. And sometimes we therefore miss the process that comes along with it.
So what's the value of the checkbox formulation of the Shulchan Aruch?
Well, at the end of the day, like we do have to do things, right? We aren't just. I know Alex likes to think a lot, the philosopher in him, but when it comes to what we do, we actually have to do something too. So the action is incredibly important, but I think what we put into that action, all the preparation that we put into it, all the meaning that we imbue it with, is actually perhaps more significant in the eyes of Hashem than the act itself.
And did that in some way guide you through all of the hubbub, tumult that
Yeah.
happened?
Yeah, I would say if you look back at this past 8-9 months on college campuses, specifically at Columbia, we never landed, right? It's not like everything that we fought for, everything that we advocated for, has been tied up in a nice little bow and knotted. It's all good. Jews feel completely welcome on college campuses once again, and everything is behind us. It's certainly not that case in the slightest. And I think that shows or displays that often the process is what life is about, right? It's very much not just about those individual moments. It's not just about Matan Torah, that moment, but it's about everything in between as well. And I think looking back on this past year, I would say there are very few moments where you could point and say, like, oh, that's where we got like a win. That's where we were able to show the university that Jews and what we believe in actually matters, and that we should be taken care of in a way that's equal to everyone else. I don't think we can point to some sort of moment, but I think certainly the growth pattern of Jewish students on campus, despite the anger and the despair and the hopelessness that many of us have felt over the last 9 months, at the same time, it's incredible to see the way in which so many of our Jewish students grew up in just a matter of months, right? We went from just being students to being forced into a position where Jews had to defend their right to exist, right? that is an amazing process, unfortunate process that Jews had to undergo on our campus, but it really tested who they were, and I think our students succeeded in so many ways.
Do you think that there's a way? You mentioned before about there were certain tools or preparation that you didn't even know that you had. So I'm wondering if you had to give this Shabbos Shubah Drasha again, would you incorporate that in some way, and how would you?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I think, when working on a college campus, so often we feel very, we're siloed off, right? It's, they talked about the ivory tower. We kind of have that too, right? And that's true in terms of the Jewish community, right? It has its own culture, its own values that are often slightly different than what might be, in a general shul-like community or somewhere else. And I feel that in my own role, right? It's like we're on an island, right? In a sense, both literally, but also in a figurative sense, that we're a self-contained community. And I think the post-October 7th world has actually showed us that we're not at all, right? We're not by ourselves. We're not alone, in a very positive way. We had the backing of the entire Jewish world, and beyond that, really just the entire kind of world of morality behind the Jewish community here. And I think some tools that we had specifically were the Jewish network that we have. The number of people who reached out over the last number of months who were able to help us in terms of major Jewish federations and foundations and people with expertise in anti-Semitism and legal issues and educational equality. And these are people who I knew, or people within the broader JLIC community were able to connect us with. And in our kind of figurative Rolodex, we were able to connect with them because we already had those relationships.
That's really great.
So, Rabbi Elie, thank you so much for this. It's incredibly enriching and nurturing. Part of what I'm getting out of this is so there's this distinction between the action itself and the hachana, the preparation for the action. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you're diagnosing a sense of anxiety on the part of your students, so that there's a set of things that we need or that we want, we're hoping for, that we're not quite getting, we're not quite achieving, we're not quite realizing. But then you're saying, but don't remember it's the preparation that's important. That's what's vital. I want to make sure I'm understanding that right. And then I'm curious how you engage still the follow up anxiety of but Ravelli, there's still so much that that we're not getting done. There's still so much that isn't right, so wrong, and I feel hopeless, and still like, how do I keep going when if I'm preparing for Shabbos? So I know whether I'm ready or not, Shabbos is going to come. But here the horizon is open ended, and we don't know if and when success is going to be something we'll reach.
Yeah, it's the age-old question. When's Mashiach coming? When is Geula gonna be?
Right, that's exactly what I'm asking you.
We, yes, I have an expertise in calculating the end of days. I think certainly I would very much welcome a time of normalcy on our college campuses and on the campus in which I engage students all the time. But absent of that at the moment, the process through which our students have gone through, and certainly I would very much love to have not had to go through any of this and have our students go through this. Certainly especially the more painful moments in late April. But our students have engaged in what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be a Zionist, in ways that I think they never could have imagined before. Some of my most proud moments, just thinking about some of our students, we have obviously some students who are the students who are going to be out there protesting, right? That's their calling. They're out there. They're ensuring that people know they exist. But then we have other students who just want to go to class, and who just want to, pass their exams. And when I hear from those students who are often somewhat quieter on this issue, just because they're trying to focus on their work, when I speak to them, they have been just as transformed as the students who are out there. Right? You might think that the students who are out there have been the most engaged and therefore the most transformative experiences, but actually I think it's done that for everyone. It's made people double down on their identity, but also recognize that we live in a world that requires us to speak up for ourselves, and requires them to think about what Jewish identity means to them and show up and engage with their Jewish friends, and also specifically their non-Jewish peers. That's been a challenge for a lot of our students who felt that their non-Jewish peers let them down. Right? When you see that post on Instagram or TikTok that devalues Jewish lives, I know students who have approached their peers about that. Right? Sometimes it goes okay, sometimes it goes less than okay. But the fact that Jewish students are willing to do that, I think, speaks volumes as to what it means to be a Jew, and I think it might even validate the educational system that we've put into place over so many years: education, yeshiva education, gap year programs, and the way in which Jews are able to connect on a very deep level to people in Israel and to their fellow Jews in America as well.
I hope it validates the JLIC model too. They have the incredibly powerful support from somebody like you and Tamar. I'm curious.
Rabbi Elie, did you just say something positive about the modern Orthodox Jewish educational system? Is that allowed?
I guess you'll have to have me on a second time to discuss in further detail.
Right. And really, you spoke so beautifully and poignantly about the growth and kind of maturation of individual students. I'm curious about the feeling and sense of the community overall, and just the feeling of solidarity and togetherness, and just what it meant to be your little siloed ivory tower Jewish community at Columbia. If there's been a change or transformation and what that experience is like and what it's meant to be.
Sure. I'll give one example. At some point in March or April, there was some kind of vitriolic march outside, one of many, taking place, on Broadway in Amsterdam, and it was running essentially right into Shabbos, and it was actually continuing Friday night into Shabbos. And I remember a number of our students had, been counter-protesting, and, it's now time for mincha, and Jewish students are, flocking to shul, and there was this change of the violence outside and the calm and peacefulness of Mincha and Kabbalat Shabbat. And you could also see it on the faces of the community, knowing everyone knew what was happening outside, and at the same time, everyone knew that it was Shabbos, right? And the sense of restfulness and menucha that our students were experiencing at that moment was incomparable. You cannot compare it to anything that happened on a previous Shabbos for them, because it was such a unique moment in their personal lives and communal lives that we can celebrate Shabbos, Hashem's creation of the world, Hashem giving us this ability to rest, and seeing what's taking place outside at the very same time. So Jews were able to come together as a community in these incredibly moving moments, this Friday night being one that strikes me as well. And then, of course, the many other times we came together, community, both, and I would add, both religious, Orthodox Jewish community, and also Jews across the spectrum. This past year, I had the opportunity to engage on a very deep level with so many Jews who I'd never known before, because we all shared this common Jewish Zionist identity that we hadn't kind of expressed to each other before, but now we were partnering in really incredible ways.
Really, I really could feel the warmth and comfort of that Kabbalah Shabbos enveloping me. It's incredibly powerful, and it strikes me that it's another vital aspect to the hachana vector, where on the one hand, we were talking about it earlier as, well, maybe we won't reach the promised land, but the value of the journey and the process is what really matters. But here, there's also, no matter how rough things are outside on Broadway or whatever street is outside Columbia, we also know we have these oases in time of a Shabbos, or our sense of just being together, our friends we know we're going to see, our community, knowing that they're there and knowing that we'll be able to still be together no matter whatever else is going on. And that even when things are really rough and awful, there's a sense of waiting for and knowing we'll be able to come back to the solidity of the community and the warmth and nurturing sense of just love and care and devotion. I think my last question on this front is, we talked about the transformation for so many of your students, and talked a little bit about the renewed sense and vitality of community. And I'm curious for you, as a rabbi, as a person, as a Jew. You've been through a lot the last year. You've had a huge amount on your shoulders, which you've handled with extraordinary aplomb. But I'm curious if you feel changed.
That's an excellent question. I would say I still have not found the time to be as introspective as I would love to do. And now that it's the summertime, and now that you've actually asked me that question, I should probably take the next few weeks and answer that question. I'll just share. I would say the beginning of the year, October, November, were just times of absolute shock, and in many ways a complete sense of being overwhelmed by what was taking place, because you feel it similar to the beginning of COVID on a personal level, on a communal level. And then once we kind of got our footing a bit, I definitely feel that what it meant to lead, to guide this community, meant something very different, because now we were actually fighting for the right of Jewish students to be Jewish, essentially, on college campuses. Right before, our battle was against waking up in the morning and getting them to minyan, or come to a shir, make sure that you come to understand kashrus and Shabbos, and whatever it might be. And now it was a much more basic necessity of a survival. And then the question was, how do you go from there to thriving? And I think we have made that shift, because I think Jewish students have now taken, and since the beginning, I would add, have taken the high ground, right? We've never debased ourselves in any way, shape, or form, and are really, I would say, looking internally to their Jewish identity and then expressing that in the most positive way. And personally, that has given me much nachas over the past year. And that has been something that I've personally tried to kind of bring to the forefront. And then obviously, in April when things got very bad on campus, and somehow my name got out there a bit through a message, that was a moment where it became very clear that Jewish voices matter, and they can matter, and we're able to bring a moral clarity to the world around us through just a couple of words. Lahavdil, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, when davening for Miriam, has a very short prayer, and yet that becomes a very important, fundamental idea that you don't need to daven forever to make an impact. And even one small voice, one small text, one small incident, one small action by a student can really impact the trajectory of a story, of a narrative. Because I think overall, Jews on campus have felt that we had no narrative to tell. And I think that the tides have shifted. And I think the world has seen, certainly the American public has seen, kind of the insanity that has taken over many of our campuses. And we have allies. And it's important for us to recognize that.
It was really powerful. I'm so glad I asked you that question.
Can I just ask, why do you think that it took until this far along into the conversation to bring up the headlines that you made? When I mentioned it in the very beginning, you put your head in your hands. I think, if I saw that correctly on the video. And so I'm wondering, like, did we not ask the right questions, or are the headlines missing something? Was it not an important part of the year?
So I would imagine it was certainly an important part of the year for the world, but I think in my own time here, it was a busy 2-3 days. But I was much more impacted and influenced by the 8 months of what the students were doing. Right, I was not on the forefront in many ways. I was supporting my students. It was only in that one brief moment where personally I felt that we couldn't be there in the way that we needed to because there was too much chaos. That I had to send that message, and obviously that ended up being a wake up call for much of the country, and brought national attention to what was going on. But for me, that was late April, right? That was like, finals were like a week away. So certainly it was a moment, but I think if we think about kind of the major theme that we're discussing here, hachana versus like the maisa, the action itself, that was like a moment of action, certainly important and critical, but overall, it really did play a very insignificant role in the previous 8 months.
Are you and Doug Emhoff still in touch?
We spoke. We spoke on the phone once. I actually have a voicemail from him because originally I did not pick up the call. Right? It doesn't say White House calling. It just says block number. And it was a busy time for me, and I was receiving many blocked number calls from many news outlets, and I was just trying to prepare for Pesach. It was Erev Pesach at the time, and I didn't pick it up. And then it started saying on my screen, it starts to essentially write out what the voice recording is saying, which is a cool thing that phones have now. And it said, "Hey, it's Doug Emhoff." And I have about 10 seconds of that. Then I picked up the phone and we spoke for a couple minutes.
Just to be clear, you haven't really given any interviews since that happened. This is the first one, right?
This is the first interview. Wow. I did speak briefly to Jake Tapper on the phone after this whole thing emerged, as he was the one who broke the story. Just got a phone call, picked it up, said, "Hi, it's Jake Tapper." I said, "Oh, hi." But besides that, that is correct. I rejected 80 interviews.
Torah JLIC podcast with the exclusive interview with Rabbi Elie Beuchler. Can we go back to hachana for a second, and can you answer why there's no hachana allowed on Shabbos?
Oof. I think it's because the whole purpose of the hachana prior to Shabbos is to get you in a place where everything is perfect, right? Shabbos is Me'in Olam Haba, so it's this moment where you have everything you need, right? Yeah, even if you had forgotten to cook that food that is now sitting raw on your counter, it's happened before, right? You're stuck because you didn't really need it. Like, you'll be okay. And so Shabbos is a time where we don't prepare anything really on Shabbos, for Shabbos in terms of malacha, obviously. And we're also not going to prepare for after because, like, we want this to be it, right? This is, quoting one of those million Jewish songs about Shabbos and Shabbos being this moment of paradise. We have everything we need, our family, our friends, our Torah with us at the moment. And in some ways, we don't really want Shabbos to come to a close, so why should you prepare for what's to come?
So there is, at a certain point, a focus on the Misa, focus on the action.
Or perhaps the inaction, right? It's like we keep Shabbos by really not doing many things.
Right. Yeah, and then so the inaction is also not preparing.
Yep, absolutely.
Can you tell me, as someone who has experience both on in a pulpit position and at JLIC, which may be considered a pulpit position, but at least is a non-traditional one, can you speak about differences, pros, cons, what you like, dislike?
So I think in many ways there's a lot of similarities. Obviously, fundamentally, it's about kind of promoting Torah, its values, relationships with people. What I think is unique about college campus, which I think college campuses in this way share with, let's say, a summer camp, is that the level of engagement is just out of this world, right? In a shul, you might see someone on Shabbos. You might even see them once during the week. But on a college campus, you probably will see that individual, 20 times that number throughout the week. Even if they're not a regular to a minyan or a shiur, you're going to see them in the dining hall. You're going to see them out, on the street. You're going to see them walking into a building that you might be in as well. And so there is this immense amount of influence and kind of connection that you can make with students and impact their future. I'm often asked, well, when you're on a college campus, you only get to know them for like a couple of years and then they move on and then you get new kids. And yet, in many ways, I feel that the couple of years that you have with them are so intense in terms of the ability to forge relationships and the ability to teach and to learn from each other, that in many ways it outnumbers the encounters or the impact that many people may have in a kind of traditional pulpit setting.
Yeah, it's something that's really special about JLIC, which is the position is so much molded around creating relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's amazing about it is we not only get to do it with, let's say, the students who opt in, right? It's the students who come to Minyan, the students who come to the shiurs, but we also have the opportunity to just like sit in the dining hall, right? And people see you, people recognize you, and your students introduce you to other students. And so our impact can be exponentially greater through that network.
That's awesome.
Elie, are there any questions you want us to ask you?
Any questions? I don't know. I feel very privileged to be on this podcast. I already listened a little bit to some of the early episodes that have just come out. I think, I'm often asked by students, by parents, by everyone who I cross paths with, what will next year bring, right? That's the common question. And I'm guessing you didn't ask it because you're in the thick of it and you know that such a question is like, I am certainly no Navi and I don't want to be a Navi Sheker either. So that is a question I'm often asked. The answer is I don't know. So I will let that.
Well, I'm just looking forward to the calm period on campus around the upcoming election.
Oh, man.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Elie, for your work, for all you and Tamar do, and for coming on our little podcast here.
Thank you.